We have this understanding that the cells are built a certain way. Well, the practitioners who are here, we're clinicians. We're interested in looking at the body and how we can intervene in such a way that we can improve well-being. We can optimize well-being, all right? And we're going to look at the clinical aspect here. Tensegrity structure. This is from Dr. Ingber, who's the cell biologist at Harvard, who did the cellular research, basically proving what others have been saying, like Dr. Levin over the years, actually visibly being able to see this at the cellular level. So Buckminster Fuller takes credit for the word tensegrity, but in fact it's something that's been around forever. So if you look at the cytoskeleton, you can actually see the geodesic framework. This is cytoplasm. Basically, this is the inside of what the cell looks like. It's a geodesic structure. It's a solid state system. And the physiology of the cell depends on the integrity of that system. Dr. Ingber goes on to state that when there's mechanical changes in the cell, you change the shape and the dynamics of the cell, you're altering the arrangement of molecules, the arrangement of how cofactors and enzymes interact, even the shape of the nucleus. Therefore, genetic expression can also be affected. And for example, when you take this structure and you alter its shape, you can actually create cell proliferation, which is, in his words, leads to the idea that maybe cancers are related to the mechanics of the cell. The other area of density is the crystalline bone structure, which we'll see today is a major area of restriction that essentially absorbs energy, changes its properties, which then impart other alterations to joint mechanics and musculoskeletal mechanics as well. So this is a little model. It's the Hoberman sphere. This represents the geodesic framework inside or around an organ, for example, a fluid-filled organ like the heart. If you imagine water being in here, use the analogy of, let's say, a water balloon, okay? If you drop a water balloon on the ground, what tends to happen to that structure? Okay, if it's filled with water. The water can only do one thing. Water, by its nature, is extremely dense packed molecules. You cannot push water molecules any closer than they are. It's called a non-compressible substance. Extremely tightly packed, very dense, therefore very heavy. All right? So when energy, mechanical energy is transferred to the fluid has to do something with the energy converted to kinetic energy. It can only expand outward. That energy, in my opinion, is transferred to the structures around it, including the myocardium, the pericardium, and ultimately the chest wall. All right? So we see people we talk about these, enlarged hearts. We know people who are not athletes have enlarged hearts. Some athletes have enlarged hearts. Some don't. Many non-athletes have enlarged. So this idea of why an enlarged heart happens, or even myocardial hypertrophy, some of it is based on, again, confounding evidence. We say, oh, it's an athlete, therefore that's why it happened. I would say it's questionable at best. All right? So we're changing the mechanics of these tissues, and therefore these organs now become centers of restriction, which we also believe change the physiology. All right? For example, heart murmurs, cardiomyopathies, and so on. Other organs that I find commonly: liver, spleen, kidneys. We also see uterine injury. I can pretty much tell a woman, or predict, or somehow discern that she probably had an impact injury during pregnancy, because the uterus becomes a significant primary restriction the further into pregnancy that person is, okay? And they often have subsequent problems with the uterus if they've had a fall during pregnancy, for example. This represents, just in general, the fluid-filled structures within the chest cavity, but other organs, of course, are affected. Impact tends to change that, and you get enlargement because of the transfer of energy from the fluid to the organ, ultimately the chest wall, okay? And that's quite an important part of what we're doing. Bone is another rigid substance. You can tell by the way it bounced on the screen. I didn't do that myself. That just happened. And you add energy to it in terms of impact. In fact, all of the cells of the matrix expand. That oscillation model is perfect because it explains a high energy state, which is an expanded state. This is the high energy state. It oscillates between these two structures, all right? It's constantly going back and forth. However, if there is a localized concentration of energy continually maintained around the structure, it will tend more towards, in my opinion, this enlarged restricted state, which we can actually visibly see. And I'll get you to actually observe that on yourselves in a few minutes. It's kind of scary. For example, if we look at bone, we can see, this is something we learned in chiropractic school, many orthopedists. I mean, we're used to the fact that many arthritic joints, this actual bones are enlarged. And people have said for years, well, I asked the question, why is it enlarged? No one gave me a suitable answer, you know? So they say, oh, it's part of the arthritic degenerative process, it enlarges. We don't know exactly. And in fact, my contention is that it enlarges, which changes the shape, the relative shape of the structures involved, and you're basically trying to fit one structure that no longer fits in the other. It's different shapes. You get wear and tear. You get actual transfer of energy to the articular cartilage, which should not be a weight-bearing structure. It should be completely, there should be a space there, but it breaks down when you alter the shape of the structures involved, okay? So you can see that in the neck, you get changes in the shape. Here you see a neck where it's relatively horizontally shaped, and you get enlargement, lengthening of the vertebral bodies. I presented a paper at the University of Illinois in 2004. Dr. Masi, who's the head of rheumatology, I think you've conversed with him, he read about my work and invited me to come down and do a presentation, and he said his particular interest was ankylosing spondylitis. I said, well, I haven't seen many cases of it. And, well, of course, the universe intervened. That week, I got a new patient with ankylosing spondylitis. I called him up. I said, okay, well, how do I measure change? He said, well, these are the protocols. He gave me all the measurement processes to measure any change. Well, they have never seen improvement in ankylosing spondylitis, right? They always see a declining pattern of symptoms and loss of mobility and so on. It's a very severe degenerative arthritic condition of the spine, by the way, also called Marie-Strumpel's disease, okay? And it's a genetically, I would say there's a genetic marker which predisposes the individual, but in cases that I've seen since, for that one and subsequent, the onset of symptoms usually due to significant injury. That's what seems to precipitate the onset of the symptoms and the restrictions. So what is normal in those people is that they actually have enlarged, you can see the enlargement of the vertebrae and the disc space, and I mentioned that to Dr. Masi. I said, it looks like these vertebrae are actually lengthening, and because they're actually embedded in calcium, they're so obviously visible. He said, you know, you're right. We never considered it, right? So there's actually that change you can see in graphic form. So areas of bone, areas of our body that are very vulnerable. Humans, because of the kinds of activities we do, we have a high center of gravity as well. We do high-speed sports, skiing, skating. Chris is a good example right here. He's had to put him back together many times. But essentially, we tend to fall on parts of our body that transfer a lot of energy to our structure. So I've indicated, this is from my book, indicates many of the sites we see as primary impact sites in the skeletal structure. Now, of course, that energy is also transferred internally to the organs, okay? But you can actually visibly see changes in many of these bone structures. So structures most vulnerable, the fluid-filled organs and the bones. The cranium is an interesting one. We've done a few studies looking at the cranium. Clinically, we see many, many head injuries, of course, and we see evidence that this fluid-filled nature is very important. We see energy being transferred from the skull to the fluid to the opposite side of the skull. We can actually measure those changes. It causes rupturing of blood vessels, changes in skull shape and integrity, and as well as alteration of apparent neurological issues. So we see many, we measure routinely neurological things here, like Babinski response, pathological reflex. For those of you not clinicians, these are ways of measuring change in the nervous system, which most people associate with damage to the nervous system, when in fact, changes to the shape of the skull seem to create the same problem, because we can actually correct those by treating the skull. So I know I'm not fixing the brain cells. All I'm treating is the skull. And we seem to be getting rid of Babinski responses and getting rid of pathological reflexes and so on.